Most solopreneurs who've been on this path for more than a year carry a private accounting. On one side, what they've built, what they've survived, what they've figured out entirely alone. On the other, a standard, borrowed from the culture that sold them this path, against which none of that ever quite feels like enough. That standard didn't come from nowhere. It came from a specific cultural moment, a decade of content, podcasts, books, Instagram captions, and LinkedIn manifestos that told a very particular story about what independence asks of you. Work harder than everyone else, outlearn, out-execute, need less. Be the person who figures it out alone, because that's what the solo path is for. Here's what that story left out. Not accidentally, not maliciously, but structurally, because the people who built it were operating in a completely different kind of environment than you are. And the gap between their environment and yours is exactly where the psychological cost lives. That's what this video is about. Not a critique of hard work, not a case against ambition, a precise accounting of what the culture's map got wrong and why applying that map to your operating environment has been costing you more than it should. Here's the specific thing that happens when you study where hustle culture actually came from. The psychological model, at its core, work harder, push through, figure it out, don't stop, was built in and for team-based environments. Startup culture, agency culture, the early tech world where everyone was in the same room, burning the same hours, moving toward the same thing. In those environments, the cultural prescription worked, not because it was psychologically sophisticated, but because the environment itself was doing a lot of invisible work underneath it. When you're in a team, you have feedback loops running constantly. Someone pushes back on your idea in a Tuesday meeting. Someone catches the flaw in your thinking before it becomes a decision. Someone sees the win when it lands and knows exactly what it cost. You have identity witnesses, people who see you operate, who know your capability across time, who can tell the difference between a bad week and a capability problem. You have ambient accountability, not a system, not a ritual, just the natural consequence of other people depending on you and you depending on them. And you have what nobody ever bothered to name because it was so ordinary. The hallway conversation, the low-friction, unscheduled, accidental thinking out loud that happens when other humans are physically nearby. That infrastructure, the feedback, the witnessing, the accountability, the accidental conversation, was cushioning the psychological cost of the hustle standard the entire time. And here's the structural blind spot that changes everything. When that standard traveled out of the team environment and into the content ecosystem, it lost all of its supporting infrastructure. The prescription stayed. The scaffolding disappeared. Work harder, figure it out, need less is a very different instruction when there's no one in the building to push back, witness, catch the drift, or notice the win. The culture took a model that ran on social infrastructure and handed it to millions of people operating in complete isolation, without ever acknowledging that the infrastructure was doing half the work. That's not a minor omission. That's the specific gap that explains what you've been living. There are 3 things hustle culture's map was missing that matter specifically for the solo operator. Not 3 things that are hard. 3 things that are invisible until you name them. And once you name them, you can't unsee them. The first, it never accounted for the identity cost of operating without witnesses. When you're in a team environment, your professional identity is a shared construction. Other people see you perform. They hold the record. They know what you're capable of on the good days, which means they can accurately read the difficult ones. When you operate alone, you are the only witness to your own performance. And the specific problem with that is, your capacity to assess your own performance accurately degrades under pressure. On the days when it matters most, the hard decision, the failed launch, the stalled quarter, the internal assessment is the least reliable it ever is. But it's the only one you have. The culture never told you that needing witnesses isn't a dependency. It's a structural requirement of accurate self-assessment. It told you that the strong operator doesn't need external validation. It handed you a standard that was only ever functional when the environment was providing what it called weakness. The second, it never named the specific damage of making decisions without feedback loops. Research on solo operators consistently shows something that doesn't match the hustle narrative. A QuickBooks survey of more than 2,000 solopreneurs found that they work fewer hours and take more time off than business owners with employees and still report higher levels of stress. The hours aren't the variable, the isolation is. Decision quality and isolation drifts in a specific direction. Your working assumptions never get tested, which means they never get sharpened. Your risk calibration never gets challenged, which means it slowly moves in ways you can't detect from inside. The confidence you feel in a call is a poor indicator of whether the call is good, because confidence in isolation mostly reflects how long you've been thinking about something, not how well. The culture told you to trust your instincts. It didn't tell you that instincts are calibrated by exposure to friction, and that without friction, they drift. The third, and this is the one that carries the most weight, it treated the need for thinking partners as weakness rather than as operational infrastructure. In team environments, thinking partners are built in. No one has to choose them or justify them. They exist as a consequence of the structure. For the solo operator, accessing the same function requires a deliberate act, which the culture had already framed as a concession. Needing someone to think alongside isn't a gap in capability. It's what high-functioning solo operators actually do, the ones who sustain this for a decade and build something real. The culture hid that. Not because it was lying, because it never had to look. Here's the mechanism that does the most damage. When the hustle culture standard travels into an environment it wasn't designed for, and a person operating in that environment encounters the predictable consequences of the mismatch, the exhaustion, the drift, the second-guessing, the unwitnessed wins that arrive in silence. Something very specific happens in how they interpret that experience. They use the cultural standard as the measuring stick. The standard says, the strong operator figures it out alone, needs less, stays sharp without external input. The experience says, this is harder than it should be. I'm not as sharp as I was. I need things I said I wouldn't need. And the conclusion, almost universally, is not, the standard was wrong for this context. The conclusion is, I'm not meeting the standard. Something is wrong with me. That's not a reasoning failure. That's what happens when the only map you have is the wrong one. You don't question the map. You question your ability to navigate. Here's the honest version of this. Entrepreneurs broadly, across employment structures, not just solopreneurs, report mental health challenges at rates that contradict the resilience narrative the culture has built. 72% of entrepreneurs report being affected by a mental health condition. 42% have experienced burnout within the past month. These aren't people who didn't work hard enough. These are people who applied a standard that doesn't account for the structural cost and then absorbed the gap as a personal verdict. The specific mechanism running underneath the exhaustion you've been carrying is this. You've been using a map that was drawn for a different terrain. Not a worse terrain. Not an inferior one. A different one. And a map drawn for different terrain isn't slightly inaccurate. It's useless precisely where the ground gets difficult, which is exactly the moment when you need it most. Applying hustle culture's psychological model to the solo operating environment wasn't discipline. It was a category error. That's not a personal observation. That's structural. The cost you've been carrying is real, the exhaustion is real, the drift is real, but the verdict you've been attaching to it, this means something about my capability, about whether I was right to start, about whether I can actually build this. That part was borrowed from a framework that was never designed to evaluate this path. If what this video has named is landing, if some part of the private accounting has started to shift, the next step is the internal work. Identifying exactly which standards you've been running that were never built for this environment. Rebuilding the internal architecture from a more accurate foundation. There's a resource in the description built specifically for that, the 7-day guided process that starts where this video ends. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Understanding the mechanism matters, but the question that follows understanding is always the same one. Now what? There are 3 moves worth making, not as a system, not as a complete answer, but as a starting point that's honest about what it actually is. The first move is an audit, not a productivity audit, a standards audit. Take the specific expectations you're currently running against your own performance, the ones that generate the most consistent gap between what you've done and what you're willing to call enough, and ask where each one came from. Was it built for this operating environment? Does it account for the absence of feedback loops, witnesses, and thinking partners? Or was it imported wholesale from a context where those things were present and doing invisible work? Most solo operators, when they do this honestly, find that a significant portion of their internal performance standard was never designed for the environment they're actually in. That doesn't mean lowering the bar, it means calibrating it to the actual terrain. The second move is a separation. The structural cost is real, and it's not going away. Operating without feedback loops, without witnesses, without the ambient accountability of a team, does carry a psychological cost. That's structural, and it doesn't resolve by simply knowing about it. But the personal failure narrative, the cost means something about my capability, about my judgment, about whether this path was a mistake. That part is a misattribution, and misattributions can be released once you can see them clearly. The work of separation is this: every time the internal voice starts running the old account, pause long enough to ask which part of what you're feeling is the structural cost, which is real, and which part is the verdict, which is borrowed. That distinction, practiced over time, changes something real. The third move is a question worth sitting with. What would your operating standard look like if you designed it specifically for this environment? Not borrowed, not imported. Built from the ground up for a one-person operation that runs without the psychological infrastructure team environments provide by default. What feedback loops would you build deliberately, because you know the environment won't generate them accidentally? What witnesses would you create access to, because you know that accurate self-assessment requires an external reference? What thinking partner relationship would you make space for? Not because you need it to survive, but because you know it's what high-functioning operators in this context actually build. Those aren't questions that need answering today. But they're a different category of question than the one the old map was generating. And different questions tend to lead to different ground. If this opens something you want to go deeper on, the resource in the description is built for exactly what comes next. The internal rebuild that becomes possible once the attribution starts to shift. Link in the description and in the pinned comment. Which specific standard have you been holding yourself to that you're now realizing was never built for the solo path? Drop it in the comments. Let's close with the thing that actually matters here. Going solo wasn't a mistake. The difficulty isn't evidence against the choice. The psychological cost isn't a verdict on your capability, your judgment, or the legitimacy of what you're building. The honest version of this is simpler and harder than the culture made it. You chose a path that the dominant cultural narrative was actively misrepresenting, not out of malice, but because the people building the narrative had never had to navigate the specific terrain you're on. They handed you a map. The map was wrong for this ground. A wrong map is a cartographer's problem, not a traveler's. You were never going to navigate this correctly by trying harder to read a map that doesn't match the terrain. You navigate it by getting a map that was actually drawn for this ground. And that map starts with a precise understanding of what this environment asks, what it costs, and what it requires in response. That's what you're building now. Not a different level of discipline, a different level of clarity. The solopreneurs who sustain this path and build something real aren't the ones who found a way to need less. They're the ones who eventually stopped measuring themselves against a standard that was drawn for someone else's terrain and built a more accurate one. That work isn't comfortable. It's also not the admission of failure the culture trained you to fear. It's the most competent thing you can do from where you are right now, one move at a time.